On the quiet Sunday morning of the 7th of December, 1941, the sky over Oahu glowed soft and calm until Japanese bombs shattered the stillness, sending flames and black smoke twisting above Pearl Harbor. While American battleships burned and fighter pilots scrambled into combat, another aircraft thousands of miles away waited for its war. Sleek and bristling with guns, the Boeing B-17 Flying Fortress was already considered outdated. First flown in 1935 and built with the technology of the 1920s and early 1930s, it lacked the speed, range, and payload the U.S. Army Air Corps truly sought. Britain's Royal Air Force had tested it and walked away after costly failures. Yet newspapers had christened it a flying fortress, and bold headlines promised invincibility. No cold specification could explain what was about to happen. This bomber, unwanted by planners and nearly forgotten by 1941, would soon become the most celebrated American aircraft of the Second World War, flying through blizzards of flak, surviving battles that ripped away wings and tails, and etching its name into history as both a workhorse and a legend. The story of the B-17 truly begins not in the skies of war, but in the political and technological ferment of the 1920s and 1930s, when a handful of American air power visionaries, led by the fiery Brigadier General Billy Mitchell, insisted that great nations would one day depend on long-range bombers to win wars. Out of their debates and demonstrations grew a requirement for a heavy aircraft that could fly 1,000 miles with a 10,000-pound payload, ambitions far beyond the engines and aerodynamics of their time. By the mid-1930s, as Europe darkened under the rise of Hitler and Mussolini, Washington's gaze turned outward, and the U.S. Army Air Corps sought a big coastal defense bomber to strike any fleet before it neared American shores. Boeing answered the call with an all-metal, 4-engine prototype whose immense Clark-Y wings gave unmatched lift and steadiness. Young pilots trained on fragile biplanes were awed by its smooth controls and forgiving handling, and newspapers marveled at its bristling gun mounts, soon dubbing it the Flying Fortress. Yet beneath the sleek aluminum lay limitations that critics could not ignore. The large wing that gave stability also created drag, curbing speed and range. The electric systems that operated flaps and landing gear required constant maintenance compared to the simpler hydraulic systems of rivals. Inside the War Department, fierce arguments flared between Army air officers who dreamed of daylight precision bombing and naval leaders who feared huge land-based bombers would undercut the aircraft carrier. In 1936, with no foreign power yet capable of threatening U.S. shores, the purchase of many such giants seemed extravagant. Only a few dozen B-17 were ordered, almost as an experiment. Ironically, those modest beginnings and the growing tension overseas would ensure that when war came, the very bomber some planners doubted would become the unexpected backbone of America's air campaign. When war finally erupted, the Boeing B-17's baptism of fire was anything but glorious. Britain's Royal Air Force, eager for a heavy daylight bomber, received 20 B-17CS redesignated Fortress under Lend-Lease in 1941. Confidence quickly turned to disappointment. On their first raids over Norway and the continent, machine guns froze in the frigid upper air, engines failed, and formations scattered under fierce fighter attacks. Losses mounted so quickly that within a month, the RAF abandoned the type for combat, diverting the survivors to night patrol and coastal reconnaissance while ordering no more. Even as British faith wavered, Washington pushed B-17 westward to strengthen outposts threatened by Japan. By late 1941, the 19th Bombardment Group was deploying to the Philippines, where General Douglas MacArthur hoped to create a forward shield against Japanese expansion. The plan collapsed on the 8th of December, hours after Pearl Harbor. Half the B-17 on Luzon were caught on the ground at Clark Field, wrecked by bombs and strafing Zeros before they could launch their planned counterstrike on Formosa. Yet the disaster was not complete. Squadrons moved in haste to the remote Del Monte airstrip on Mindanao, keeping a nucleus of fortresses alive. From those rough fields, and later from Australia's dusty Townsville and Port Moresby, crews flew long, exhausting night missions against Japanese shipping at Vigan, Rabaul, and across the Bismarck Sea. Their courage became legend. Pilots limped home with wings shredded and control cables frayed, proving the airframe could soak up astonishing punishment. Captain Colin P. Kelly, who stayed at his station until his aircraft exploded, became America's first air hero of the war. But gallantry could not mask cold facts. Range and payload were too limited for Pacific distances, maintenance was arduous, and replacements were scarce. By 1943, every heavy bomber group in the theater had converted to the more capable B-24 Liberator. The B-17's first great campaign ended not in triumph, but in quiet withdrawal, even as a far deadlier mission awaited over Europe. Across the Atlantic, the B-17's true legend was forged in the cold gray skies of Europe. When the 8th Air Force established itself in England in mid-1942, the Flying Fortress became the spearhead of America's daylight bombing doctrine. The first mission, a tightly choreographed the 17th of August strike on railway yards at Rouen, France, was more demonstration than battle escorted by British Spitfires and unopposed in the air. It made good headlines and stirred public pride. But as the bombers pushed deeper into German territory, the promise of precision daylight bombing collided with brutal reality. The Luftwaffe rose in waves of Messerschmitts and Focke-Wulfs. Black puffs of flak filled the sky like iron blossoms. Famous missions such as the twin strikes on Regensburg and Schweinfurt in August 1943 revealed the cost of 376 B-17s dispatched, 60 never returned, and hundreds of airmen were killed or captured. A second Schweinfurt raid that October was even bloodier, again costing 60 fortresses and their 10-man crews in a single day. Inside each bomber, young men manned every gun position, chin, nose, tail, and waist fighting not only enemy fire but bitter cold that froze oxygen masks and turned bare metal to biting ice. Engineers experimented with YB-40 gunship variants bristling with extra turrets, but their weight made them slower and more vulnerable. Only with the gradual arrival of long-range escorts, first P-47 Thunderbolts with drop tanks, and finally the superb P-51 Mustang, did the tide begin to turn. By early 1944, when these fighters could stay with the formations all the way to Berlin and back, the US air offensive gained the reach and protection it needed. Through relentless raids on ball-bearing plants, aircraft factories, submarine pens, oil refineries, and transport hubs, the B-17s and their crews endured staggering losses, yet systematically crippled the Luftwaffe and paved the way for D-Day. In the frozen air above Germany, the Flying Fortress earned its immortality not by technical superiority, but by the sheer courage of the men who flew it and the industrial might that kept sending them back. By early 1944, the Allies finally held the tools to transform costly endurance into outright dominance. The appearance of the long-legged P-51 Mustang, with its powerful Merlin engine and external fuel tanks, allowed American fighters to accompany bomber streams from the English coast deep into Germany and back. Suddenly, the Flying Fortress was no longer a solitary giant, but the center of a moving fortress of steel and speed. New technology added another edge. The H-2X radar set, carried by specially trained lead crews, enabled blind bombing when European skies vanished beneath winter clouds. Formation tactics matured as well. Crews rehearsed precision timing so that hundreds of bomb bays could open at a single call, releasing dense patterns of bombs with deadly consistency. February 1944 brought the climax of this new strategy, Operation Argument, remembered as Big Week. From England and newly established bases in Italy, waves of B-17s and their B-24 partners converged on the German heartland, smashing aircraft, assembly plants, engine works, and transport hubs. The Luftwaffe fought with desperate fury but suffered irreparable losses, its experienced fighter pilots falling faster than they could be replaced. With the skies steadily clearing of German opposition, the 8th Air Force shifted to strangling Germany's fuel supply, hammering oil refineries at places like Ploesti and Leuna. Each mission was still a crucible of fire. Black flak fields rose like storm clouds, and shells shredded aluminum skins. Yet the escorts broke up massed fighter attacks before they could close. By spring, the B-17 had become not a vulnerable pioneer, but the backbone of an unstoppable aerial campaign, its vast wings carrying ever heavier loads of bombs and armor higher and farther than its designers in 1935 could have imagined. What began as an airplane already behind the times was now the central weapon in a strategy that crushed the Luftwaffe and opened the road to D-Day and the final collapse of the Third Reich. By the autumn of 1944, the B-17's mission had begun to change as rapidly as the war itself. Germany was retreating on every front, and the once desperate need to cripple the Reich's industry gave way to relentless mopping up strikes on oil plants, transport hubs, and stubborn pockets of resistance. General Jimmy Doolittle, who took command of the 8th Air Force after his triumph with the Tokyo raid and campaigns in North Africa, admired the Flying Fortress and quietly disliked the B-24 Liberator. As new P-51s guaranteed deep strike escort, he started converting some B-24 groups to B-17, planning eventually to make the Boeing his force's standard heavy bomber. But time and higher strategy worked against him. Headquarters of the U.S. Army Air Forces, already looking across the Pacific, ordered production lines to shift toward the revolutionary B-29 Superfortress for the coming assault on Japan. By the time Germany surrendered in May 1945, Doolittle's ambition no longer mattered. Thousands of weary B-17, many patched with combat scars and faded nose art, were flown to depots in France and Britain and then across the Atlantic, not to new battles, but to waiting scrapyards, where cutting torches quickly silenced their four-engine thunder. Plans to redeploy the 8th Air Force to Okinawa as a B-29 unit went ahead, yet no B-17 would ever fight in the Pacific's final act. Still, the legend only grew. Crews and correspondents had already filled newspapers and newsreels with stories of fortresses limping home on shredded wings, of gunners who fought until the last round, of a bomber that seemed to cradle its men in defiance of physics. Photographers loved its clean, imposing silhouette, and the name Flying Fortress, first coined by a Seattle reporter in 1935, remained etched in the public mind. More than any technical specification, it was the courage of those 10-man crews and the unyielding image of a silver giant holding formation over flak-torn skies that secured the B-17's immortality, turning an aircraft once deemed obsolete into the enduring icon of America's victory in Europe. When the guns finally fell silent in 1945, the B-17's story seemed destined to end in scrapyards, its hulking frames reduced to aluminum ingots. Yet the legend never faded. To the men who had flown them, the Flying Fortress was more than rivets and wings. It was a companion that carried them through fire and ice, through fear and exhaustion, often bringing them home when survival seemed impossible. To the public, it became the symbol of America's airborne might, an icon splashed across newspapers and newsreels, a machine that embodied endurance and sacrifice. More B-24s were built, and the B-29 ended the war, but it is the B-17 that lives on in memory, preserved in museums, roaring in air shows, immortalized in films and memoirs. It reminds us that legends are not born from perfection, but from struggle. An aircraft dismissed as outdated, tested in failure, yet carried by courage and circumstance to the very center of history. The Flying Fortress endures not only as a weapon of war, but as a monument to the men who climbed into its narrow fuselage, faced the cold black skies of Europe, and proved that even a flawed machine can become timeless when matched with an unyielding human spirit.